All right.
A lot of bullshit. I just want to. Are you serious? Ah, shit. What is this? Ah.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Yes, it is unfortunately time to take out the engine. Although it seems like a daunting task, it's actually not all that bad. I just thought I could finish this project without pulling it in the first place. From where we're at now, all I need to remove are the electrical harnesses and the power steering reservoir lines. As you can tell from the intro, I was having a hard time with both because I wanted to make the least amount of mess possible when pulling the power steering lines. And I also ran into some unexpected issues with the ECU wires because of the electric fan and dyne IAT wiring I already had in place prior to this project. If you don't have those, you would simply need to unplug everything and be done. But I wired some of the stuff not thinking about needing to pull this engine again, so I had to cut some wires in the end. It's all good. I'll be rewiring some of this to be a lot easier to pull the engine again in the future anyway, so it is what it is. Footage of us pulling the engine has unfortunately disappeared, so fast forward to it being out. John started cleaning out the threads before installing the new, longer exhaust studs, while I was cleaning the engine bay a little bit because of the coolant / power steering fluid / oil mess we had going on. Once the studs were in, we installed the gaskets applied with the cxracing kit and then the manifold. We had a hard time tightening down the nuts onto the studs because the exhaust wrap was in the way because it was too thick, and also because of the manifold design in some areas being right in front of the longer studs. We eventually got everything figured out and it was time to put the engine back in. After the engine was back in, the first thing I did was test fit the turbo and the downpipe to find that the downpipe was running into banjo bolt on the head, as well as this little tab next to it. The tab is used to align the coil pack wiring harness, so I didn't show this on screen, but I grounded down and hammered a little dent in the downpipe so it was colliding with the banjo bolt. Unfortunately, even after solving those two problems, the downpipe was still not fitting properly, and although this may seem like a little gap, it's not supposed to have any gaps at all and will cause exhaust gases to leak through there. I didn't know what to do just yet, so we'll revisit that later. I'm not a huge fan of the gold heat tape in engine bays, but we needed to apply some anyway with the turbo being so close to the passenger side shock tower. While waiting to figure out a good solution for the downpipe, I decided to start working on the turbo oil and water fitting placement, as well as the turbo orientation. There isn't a lot of room at this platform, so doing it this way is the best I could do. You want to place the oil return port at the bottom since that uses gravity to return oil to the pan when the engine's shut off. For the water ports, there's no inlet or outlet, but if a port's higher, you should use that as the return line as hot water will want to climb to the surface. I'm starting off by tightening the oil return port flange after installing the supplied blue gasket under it. I used the 45° 10AN fitting to connect to the return line hose later. Then I moved on to installing the oil feed port directly opposite of the return port. This is the silver oil restrictor fitting that will prevent too much oil pressure from flying into the turbo ones. After that, the brass water fittings were installed along with their crush washers. I will say, I didn't tighten these enough the first time around and they were all seeping oil or water, so do yourself a favor and tighten them well, without over tightening of course. I actually had to undo some of the fittings in order to tighten down the clocking bolts on a turbo. This part wasn't as hard, but installing the compressor housing bolts will be a pain in the because of how little room you have to work with. Now it's time to start making the water hoses and install the corresponding fittings. First, since the hose came with somewhat flared ends, I put some tape on one end to make a clean cut using a cutting wheel. Once you make your cut, don't be an idiot like me and install the fitting clockwise. It has reverse threads that I eventually discovered. I mean, if I had read the instructions in the first place, maybe I wouldn't have gotten ahead of myself. After cleaning the residue that was inside the hose, I mocked it up so that I could measure how much to cut for the other end. On lines like this, you don't want it to be very taut and want to leave a little slack to prevent vibrations from affecting the line over time. Once I had my measurement, I repeated the same steps but on the other side and started tightening the fittings on the hose. I used soapy water on the fitting to help it slide over the hose when it's screwed on. Although this looks like an oil eater bottle, it's actually soapy water. To prevent my wrench from scratching the fittings, I put some tape over it, but you can buy anti-scratch wrenches made specifically for these fittings as well. I just didn't have any. Make sure to hold down the hose as you screw it on, since it can sometimes push the hose out and ruin your seal. To make sure, you can always mark the hose behind the piece that's already on there with a Sharpie or a paint pen. That way you can see if the hose has been pushed out or not after you screwed it, and if it has, you need to redo it as it will leak. I realized that the reason we were having so much trouble with the downpipe was because this isn't the turbo that came with the cxracing kit initially. So, fitment would probably be fine if you used their turbo. With that being said, the flange on their downpipe is much thicker than the turbine housing on the PSR turbo, so we decided to grind it down to match, and that seems to have done the trick. Since we're getting close to installing the intake manifold, I tasked John with making a hole in the OEM MAF sensor block-off plate that comes with the kit so that it could fit the Ford MAF sensor instead. What he did was drill some holes and then use files to carefully grind down the sides until the sensor could fit in there while not leaving much room for potential air leaks. We obviously did this the hard way, and if you wanted to do this properly and know how to weld aluminum, then weld a Ford MAF flange on the manifold and call it done. But I don't know how to weld aluminum yet, nor do I have a TIG welder anyway. I got most of the idle control valve hoses installed, and then the check valve that goes back to the fuel tank. The last idle control valve hose is the one that goes to the intake manifold, so I'll take care of that one once the manifold's in. Next up, I clean up the wiring loom on the passenger side of the car, since I'll be relocating the coolant tank to the driver's side and wanted to have the wires go across cleanly. The OEM loom was nasty anyway, so I used some high temp black electrical tape to replace it. You can see a few wires going towards the turbo. Those are going to be for the AC compressor and dryer, and I'll be covering those as well. With that all cleaned up, I started wrapping the coil pack harness because I noticed the turbo was going to be really close to that, and I didn't want to risk the plastic melting, so even though I'll have a turbo blanket, this wrap will resist quite a bit of heat, and it should do the trick. With the harness reinstalled, you can see how close the turbo and downpipe sit right next to it, so glad I had that roll of tape laying around. Moving on, I went and set up the remaining water and oil hoses with fittings and then prepped to install them. These lines run so close to the wastegate and whole turbo assembly that I actually ended up wrapping them with heat shielding as well, just to be sure. It's not shown here, but you'll see that in a future video. I really wish we recorded this, but my initial plan for the coolant tank water pipe was to cut it and re-weld it in the area we needed it. But John's dad came up with this alternative that worked really well. We essentially bent the pipe under heat by packing it with really fine sand and stuffing each end of the pipe with wooden corks. Then we put a blowtorch on the area of the pipe we're going to bend and slowly bent it backwards. Once we had the pipe bent, we made a few modifications to make sure it wouldn't move around while driving. The original tab near the water pump was cut off and welded upside down, and then we added a little metal tab that uses one of the Vanos housing top bolts to secure. Once all that was done, we painted the pipe black and installed it. This was definitely a tough task, but we figured it out in the end. Now it's time to install the intake manifold. I was definitely having a rough time at first because of how tight everything is, but also because the bracket that holds the manifold up wasn't lining up properly. You can see here there's a gap, so I used the combination of bending that part a little so it could sit flush against the manifold, but also adjusting the bottom bolts to push the bracket inwards or outwards from the engine. I didn't notice this at first, but cxracing forgot to supply some extra nuts and bolts for the bracket, so I had to pull the original rubber grommet nuts that are on the OEM manifold and use them as bolts along with some washers I had laying around. I also was able to put in the last idle control valve hose you can see here. It was a huge hassle to get the manifold couplers tightened down since these clamps kept running into stuff where I wasn't able to reach the nut in certain situations. This is how I ended up making it work in the end. I also tried to prevent boost leaks as much as I could, but I can tell you now, although it looks like everything is tight, I ended up having to redo a lot of these clamps because they were leaking air big time when I used the boost leak tester. You'll see that part in a later video. Lastly, we're modifying the factory MAF sensor harness to accept the forward MAF sensor plug. Here's a pro level Photoshop wiring diagram that you can use. You essentially only use 4 of the 6 wires going into the plug, and I also included how to wire the IAT sensor if you didn't have yours already. Mine is tapped in those wires, but it's in the ECU/DME box, so you don't see them here on the video. For those of you that don't know what a MAF or IAT sensor is, the MAF or mass airflow sensor measures the amount of air coming through the intake, and this is how the engine knows how to respond to the different boost levels. The IAT sensor or intake air temperature sensor measures the outside air temperature of the air coming into your turbo filter, or intake when you don't have a turbo. The reason why I only wired these and not this one is because I already have a Dynan IAT sensor relocation kit that is wired into the DME box already. If you don't have an IAT sensor, you need to get one, and you need to wire it to this yellow blue and the ground to this brown wire. And that's it. What's up, guys? This is the end of the video. The next video we'll be going over installing the oil catch can, as well as the rest of the intercooler piping and the GFB boost controller. So be on the lookout for that one. Hit the subscribe button so you can be notified when that drops. You know, I've been trying to put in a lot of effort to, between work and just the holidays, put in these videos, trying as fast as I can so I can get you guys up to where we're at today. But yeah, I'll keep trying, hit the like button if you like the video. I'll catch you guys later.